Greetings, everybody, and welcome to week 5 of class, week 5 of 6. We are so very close here to getting to the end of our semester together, and I am just really excited to bring things to a close because I think we've had a pretty rock solid, very quick semester so far. And so let's get down to business. Let's talk a little bit about Aristotle and Dante here. So a lot of things made me very happy as I was reading your reviews. Obviously, I like it better when you like the books. I think coming off of Hearts Unbroken, this was an easier sell. I think in general, people really liked this book. It was also really fascinating to hear you talk about the language. I think that the language, the difference in the ways in which Sáenz and Lydic Smith wield their language, I think is pretty noteworthy here. And so it was great to hear you talk about the language. I also heard the word or read the word charming a few times in a lot of your analyses in Goodreads, and I think that that's also valuable because you weren't saying it in a cutesy pejorative type of way. You found the characters themselves charming, and it seemed as though you really invested in not only Ari and Dante, but their family members as well. You invested in Legs. Legs came up a bunch of times in your responses, and so that was wonderful as well. It was good to see that Chris and Spencer took my suggestion seriously as well. As perhaps a few of you others did as well, with listening to the audiobook. Lin-Manuel Miranda obviously can't go wrong there, and so he did a great job of narrating this story and giving voice to Ari in particular. I think you felt that connection between Lin-Manuel Miranda and his investment in that particular character. So it was great reading your thoughts there, and I'm glad that most of you seem to enjoy this, particularly after the mixed reviews from Hearts Unbroken. So let's get into some of the comments that I thought were really impressive and things that really struck me as I was reading your Goodreads reviews. We will start with our first one here from Jenna. And Jenna says, the way that the families are portrayed in YA fiction has always caught my attention, and I know that I've alluded to families in previous reviews of Hearts Unbroken and The Poet X. Most of the reason that I fell in love with this book is because I fell in love with the families and the way that families are portrayed. We see everything through Ari's point of view as he tries to understand his family. I think that's a really great point. What we see here is somebody in Jenna who finds that this common thread of family matters a whole lot in these texts. And obviously that's something that she can pull on as she's working, if she were to do a keywords paper, to just go through the keyword of family and sort of figure out what does family mean in YA literature. And I tend to agree that family mattered in this text differently than it did in The Poet X, differently than it did, I would say, in Hearts Unbroken. And even so, I think we can pull it through with Serpent King as well. I think family is one of those themes that is always going to perhaps be there, and you can really, dive deep into just motherhood or fatherhood, or mothers and fathers, or rather mothers and sons, or fathers and sons, or mothers and daughters. Like, there's just different ways that you can drill down on these concepts, but I would agree that it's interesting the way that there's this dichotomy sort of created between different families and the different things that they have in common. And so I really appreciate Jenna's following through with family, because we saw that the Mendozas and the Quintanas really had these very different dynamics here. And there was a sense of pride that we saw from Dante that was confusing and confounding when it came to Ari's relationship, particularly with his father. But also just that idea of family mystery, right, with regard to Bernardo. And so we see that these different types of relationships between siblings as well, between parents and children, just the way that they're complicated throughout YA literature, I think, is really interesting. It's worth noting that not all the reviews were terribly glowing, or there were some moments of tension, I would say, that some of you noted. We have this first quote here from Madison. And Madison said, there were just a couple of things that kept this from being a 5-star review for me. Firstly, this book didn't demand my attention. It didn't keep my turning the pages like like The Poet X or The Serpent King. It was much more casual read. And then sort of similar to that, I found Caitlin said, I was not so sure about this book at first, only because I found it hard for myself to stay invested in it initially, and it took me longer to pick up than the other readings. And I think that was something that, going particularly from Hearts Unbroken to this, I think there may be something there. I felt that Hearts Unbroken, just the language and the narrative were gentler, lighter perhaps. And then coming from there into Sáenz's poetic language, I think Ben talked about that. The way he used language was just a little bit heftier, I felt like, and so that made it a little bit tricky, I think, for us to be able to get into a book that was just a little bit, it was perhaps denser even, beyond just the subject matter, just the language and the way that the narrative was being told, for some of y'all, seemed like it was a little bit harder to get into. And that's fine as well. It wasn't necessarily a page turner, but there was this constant sort of back and forth, which we didn't know was happening. Or perhaps a lot of you did sort of catch on pretty early about the way that Dante had feelings for Ari, and the way Ari wasn't really sure that he had any feelings for Dante in the same way. Like that back and forth perhaps didn't land very early for some of you to get into the text, but I think that for me, it was one of those are they or aren't they kind of types of things. It was the way that sort of kept me. But it did take, I remember the first time reading this, it took me a little bit to get into it. And I'll be honest, because I knew the ending, it was just more enjoyable the second time around to listen as Lin-Manuel told the story. And then I really like this final comment here from Jonathan. Jonathan said, regarding the supplemental reading for this week, I appreciated that there were no concrete conclusions about certain aspects of Ari's identity. This seems to make this novel encompass what I understand to queer theory to be the fluidity of sexual identity. Life is about questioning, changing, growing, and loving, and Aristotle and Dante was a great story about all that and more. P.S. I guess the sequel is coming out in October. I can't wait. And all of that, I really appreciate the connection to the theory that we read for this week that sort of relates to not just this idea of queer being, we have gay characters, so this must be a queer YA novel. Obviously, we read that that's not necessarily the case, according to Malin. And so I think that's a wonderful point that Jonathan's making here, is that it's not just about the relationship between them, but the challenges with this heteronormativity that I think YA is gunning for. They're aiming for that. And yes, there is a sequel in October, and I'm excited that Jonathan's excited to pick it up in October. We'll have to reconnect for those of you who are going to pick that up. And so this is a perfect segue into the reading for this week. So Carrie Milan, she wrote about queer, the keyword queer, and I really did appreciate the fact that there were no definitive definitions or underpinnings necessarily of queer, which is in line with what queer could and possibly mean or not mean. And so starting off with some of that notion, Milan says this: queer refuses to settle comfortably into a single classification, preferring instead to traverse several categories that would otherwise attempt to stabilize notions of chromosomal sex, gender, and sexuality. And so I really like that difficulty, that it's a slippery term, right? Which means it's hard for us to really nail down what it means to be queer, or even, as we see, and we'll talk about in just a second, to queer something. And so both queer being an adjective, but also being a verb, to queer something. And how do we queer YA literature as a genre? How do we queer texts? How do we queer characters? And so there's a lot of different ways that we can use this terminology, but we do need to be cautious, I feel like, because it is a reappropriated term. It wasn't always something positive. At times it was something pejorative. And so going into that, we see that the reappropriation of queer, changing it from an insult to a linguistic sign of of affirmation and resistance, that's according to Judith Butler there, was an important precursor to the radical theorization that was to follow, namely queer theory. And so a lot of this comes to us from queer theory, comes from Judith Butler talking about the performative nature of queer, what it means to exist or to challenge what it means to be normative, heteronormative, and challenge that normativity through what society believes to be a correct or normal way of being. And so going into that, then we find this other quote here that extends Butler's ideas. In troubling gender categories and their support of gender hierarchy and compulsory heterosexuality, Judith Butler developed the notion of performativity in her influential books, Gender Trouble, Feminism and Subversion of Identity, and Bodies That Matter, on the Discursive Limits of Sex. Butler's proposition of the performative considers that gender is not what one is, but what one does. It is in doing one's gender that subjects repeat and reiterate prior norms that constitute them as a boy or a girl. Gender can be performed differently when one refuses to conform to these norms by blurring the gender boundaries. And so I think that's really important here. So as we're exploring these ideas in this text, as well as if anybody's going to extend this into your keywords, recognize that performative nature is really important. So we somehow get really shocked when someone is subversive, when a male goes into a public place and wears a dress. For some people that's shocking, and people become up in arms because that's not the way men are supposed to act or dress. There are certain biological expectations that are then inscribed within one's body, as well as inscribed in one's clothing choices, right? And so that's the way someone is supposed to act. And when one doesn't do that, when they are subversive with these things that we as a society have, all agreed upon, that becomes problematic within certain communities, right? And so people become uncomfortable with that. But we see that performative nature as well, and I tried to touch on this in the keywords as I introduced the book last week, with this idea that perhaps the notion of masculinity is challenging too. So when we see, for example, Dante cry after a bird is being killed, shot by a BB gun, right? We see him crying. That, for some people, is counter to what society would expect from a male, right? Women are supposed to be the sensitive ones, men are supposed to be the tough, guarded ones, and so that performativity of femininity or masculinity, depending on how you look at what the expectations of men and women are in society, is something that I think Sáenz also does a nice job of challenging. So when we talk about a text like Aristotle and Dante, we're not just talking about the fact that we have queer characters. We're talking about the fact that the way that they engage with expectations, societal expectations, particularly in El Paso, Texas in 1987, the context here matters as well. And so that confusion that Ari in particular is having is perhaps more understandable. The freedom that Dante has, the self-assuredness that Dante sort of develops in expressing his feelings for Ari is something that's unique for the time, but we see more and more in YA literature these types of characters taking front row and taking a prominent place in young adult literature. And so that's something that we can be proud of that has changed over time, that perhaps hasn't always been the case. There haven't always been these characters. There haven't always been these books for young people. And so just one final thought here with a few quotes. A story about a gay character does not make it ipso facto a queer story, though such stories may indeed be queer. So again, the keyword queer here may seem appropriate, but we need to ask ourselves, just because we have gay characters, gay protagonists in particular, does that make Aristotle and Dante discover the secrets of the universe, does that make this text a queer text? And I think you could make debates either way. So going on a little bit more, we see integral to this aesthetic or sensibility are the narratives narrative processes that draw readers' attention to the incoherencies in a binary system of sexual identity and to the oppressive regulation of sexual desire and practice in a social order that is dominated by meta-narratives of heteronormativity. So that's a lot to say there, but sort of what we've been talking about. Anything that pushes against that binary and those expectations of heteronormativity that society has imposed upon characters, particularly young people, is a text that we might consider queer because it pushes against those binaries, that boys in high school are supposed to like girls in high school. So it goes beyond that, but because it's pushing against those binaries, perhaps then we can argue that this is a queer YA novel. Would we diagnose it as such? Would we talk about it in those types of ways? Would we describe it in that way? I don't know. And so one final point here. Queer YA fiction often deals with the subject of desire as a counter approach to mainstream identifications and pleasures that dominant culture denies or prohibits to GLBTI subjects. Sorry, that's a different organization of those words. I think most of us, perhaps by this point, are used to LGBTQIA+. So I apologize for stumbling there. But yes, we look at I think actually the desire is the key term there, looking at the desire as a counter approach to mainstream identification. So mainstream identifications, I think, are changing. Again, this was written a decade ago, and so if we were to rewrite the keyword for queer, I think it might look a little bit different today. So again, I think these are just really valuable points that we might consider as we are looking through. Again, we are going to be continuing on. We do have a minor gay character in our next book. So this brings me to Lendeborn. And Lendeborn next week, so for example, two things. You will be moving on from this text that we've been reading, the different keywords. And I wanted to give you just a little bit of a different text. It is Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's introduction to her book called The Dark Fantastic. And this is, like I said, an introduction, so it's part of a much larger text, but it's an academic text, but there's an audiobook for it. I listened to it. It's pretty good. And it is about where Black characters see themselves in fantasy novels, where they see themselves in society also. And so The Dark Fantastic is about BIPOC populations being included within fantasy. So that's The Dark Fantastic. I found this image here online of a quote from Ebony Elizabeth Thomas that says, "Black people have always counter-storied the whole of U.S. life, from slave narratives through the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement. Fairy tales are no different." And so I think y'all will like the introduction. It's not the full text, obviously, but I do like that it's a little bit different from keywords, gets you into a different space and gets you thinking with some different scholars. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas did contribute to the newer edition of the Keywords book. So there's a newer children's literature keywords book. And so if you like this, you may want to read what she wrote for that. But I think you'll find this an interesting supplement to Lendeborn. And so you will read the introduction for this. You will also read Lendeborn. Reminder, of course, y'all are doing a great job with your original posts in Goodreads. Make sure that you are responding to two peers by the end of the week, which is Sundays, by 11:59 p.m. All right, so you have until midnight to respond to two peers in Goodreads. I just want to make sure that everyone's getting your full points. I hate taking off points for technicalities. The other thing that I want you to continue to work on is looking for your picture books. And so I put up more descriptions on the Flipgrid board. The Flipgrid board is ready for you to post your picture book talks whenever you are ready to do so. So if you want to do your book talks and post them in Flipgrid, they are ready for you now. So you can do that anytime between now and the end of the semester. So make sure you're doing that. And then also continue working on those final projects, whether you're doing a keywords project or whether you are doing lesson plans. And so that's for next week. With regard to Legendborn, you'll notice on the cover here that it won the Coretta Scott King Award in 2021 for Best New Author. A great award for Tracy Deonn, well deserved. It is the story, Legendborn is the story of a young girl named Bree Matthews who is a 16-year-old who attends an early college program, and she's originally from Bentonville, North Carolina, a very small town in North Carolina, and she's attending an early college program at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And she has just lost her mother to a hit-and-run car accident, but there's some mystery shrouding this whole thing. She doesn't know what's happened really to her mother. There's just some questions that need answering, and so she goes to this early college program to sort of get away from things, but in the process of doing so, she gets mixed up in this fantasy world, in this existence of these Shadowborn people, these Legendborn people, which also brings about some secrets of her mother and her past. And so I don't want to say too much. It's hard for me to not go into a little bit more depth there, but I think y'all will enjoy this book. Very different from anything we've read so far this semester. And it is sort of like this, the best I can describe it, it's like this combination of a new and improved King Arthur legend, counter-narrative, in addition with, like, there's elements of Hogwarts from Harry Potter, with elements of survival and competition from the Hunger Games, with just elements of Octavia Butler and, speculative fiction, fantasy, going back in time, touching on legacies and ancestry. Like, it's hard for me to sort of explain it. I will say this, I'm not a huge fantasy fan, and I really love this book. I really do think it's fantastic. The thing is, some of you have mentioned, even with like Hearts Unbroken, that you had a hard time keeping up with the characters. If that was the case with Hearts Unbroken, you are definitely going to want to like jot down notes and maybe make like a mind map of all the different characters, because there's a lot of characters, and you may want to figure out like who's an allegiance with who and who belongs to who and whose bloodline do they, because it is sort of like a King Arthur legend. There are a lot of characters from different, existences, different family lines and bloodlines. And so it may be useful for you as you are getting into this text to have a piece of paper next to you and you are taking notes. I will leave you for this week with a few keywords. And so you'll see these keywords here: fantasy, and I think fantasy counter-narrative is appropriate, race and racism, which is sort of tied to this notion of modern Southern aristocracy, with also family, history, and mystery, early college, and just college in general, and then romance. And so I will leave you with this final quote here. Grief does strange things to people's minds, this I know. One morning, a couple of weeks after my mother died, my dad said he thought he could smell her cheesy grits cooking on the stove, my favorite and my mother's specialty. Once I heard her humming down the hall from my bedroom, something so mundane and simple, so regular and small, that for a moment the prior weeks were just a nightmare, and I was awake now, and she was alive. Death moves faster than brains do. So that's what I'm going to leave you with. Happy reading of Legendborn this week. I think you'll really enjoy it. Y'all take care.